I bet you didn't know these shocking confessions people came clean with while on their deathbed. Right before his life ended, one man confessed that while serving in Vietnam with his twin brother, he murdered him. And he simply blamed it on the war. His reasoning? He wanted to steal his twin brother's identity so that he could be married to his twin brother's wife. The children claimed they thought it was the dementia making him talk that way, until they found a handwritten confession tucked away in a Bible at his home. On his deathbed, one man confessed to his wife that he had accidentally shrunk several very expensive sweaters that she owned. He was too ashamed to admit to it, so he just threw them away. The woman assumed one of her friends had stolen them or kept looking to see if they would turn up. Of course, she forgave him and they had one last good laugh before he passed. An 86-year-old woman was on her deathbed. She had her family hang 14 crosses in her room. When asked why, she said she needed the crosses because they would keep her safe from the 14 souls that she took. What? One man finally confessed why he had a tattoo on his arm. He was the pastor of a church and he never wanted to speak of this tattoo. He confessed that when he was 19, he was part of a bank robbery and he was a safecracker. They were all caught and served some time in prison. And while in prison, he decided to get a tattoo. While on her deathbed, one woman confessed that she gave birth to an illegitimate stillborn child at her home. She then put the baby's body in the freezer down in the basement because she could not have the community knowing what had happened. I bet you didn't know these weird facts that'll probably make you uncomfortable. Dying by being encased in concrete is way more horrifying than you'd think. Even though you already think it's horrifying, it gets worse. It isn't really the crushing or as asphyxiation that gets you. It's the extreme burns on your skin from the concrete sucking every bit of moisture out of your body. Concrete also lets off heat as it dries. I know this because once when I was making a headstone, I got concrete all over my hands, and they burned and felt like alligator skin. When you die, your brain will actually know you're dying. Like you'll be aware of it, at least until the oxygen deprivation to the brain and it stops working. Most sitcom laugh tracks were recorded in the 1950s. That means while you're watching a show with a pre-recorded laugh track, you're listening to dead people laughing. Humans' bite force is strong enough to bite clean through your finger, like literally straight through the bone. The only thing stopping it? Your brain's natural safety factor. I bet you didn't know about spaghettification and the fact that it has absolutely nothing to do with spaghetti, but has everything to do with astrophysics. Okay, so what is spaghettification? It's the tidal effect that's caused by strong gravitational fields. Like when falling into a black hole, for example. Your body is stretched out vertically, but compressed horizontally. It pretty much would cause you to turn into a very thin, long shape. And that comes from tidal forces. So what would spaghettification feel like? Well, it's gonna hurt, like a whole lot. Imagine just getting violently stretched. Eventually, you would be pulled so thin that you would snap in half, most likely at the weakest point being your waist area. And then the pieces that broke off would then do the same thing. But where does it get its name? Scientists literally call it spaghettification simply because it would turn your body into what would look like a spaghetti noodle. So deep and profound. I bet you didn't know these creepy facts that'll give you nightmares.
Hallucinations come in very different forms. People who are beginning to go blind see very realistic and very absurd hallucinations. This is called Charles Bonnet syndrome. In one case, a woman was diagnosed with glaucoma. Her life was very normal until a trip to the grocery store triggered her hallucinations. The shelves would begin to drip and turn into thick mud. She could pull an item off the shelf, but the mud was too thick for her to actually put the item back. These hallucinations can become so vivid that people can see animals or vivid landscapes without them actually being there. In ancient China, there was a process where they would mummify people with honey. In order to do this, an elderly person would volunteer themselves. They'd usually already be pretty close to death. they would begin binge bathing in honey and only be given honey to eat. They waited until their entire digestive system was just full of honey. Then, when the volunteer died, they would be covered in honey for 100 years. After a century or so, the contents were turned into candy and said to heal broken bones. What? The Black Death was a pretty big deal centuries ago, and there's a reason it became an epidemic. The bacteria that's responsible for the Black Plague is unable to survive outside the body of its victims. But it has a secret weapon. It can disable its host's immune system. With nothing to oppose it, it can multiply quickly and overrun its victim very, very, very rapidly. Like, I'm talking about within hours. No one actually knows how Edgar Allan Poe died. All of his death records have been lost. Poe was just found in Baltimore streets. Eerily, he was wearing someone else's clothes. He was in pretty bad shape. I mean, there's literally nothing left from his medical records. There's no copy of his death certificate. There are many speculations about how he actually died. I mean, he was only 40 years old. A lot of people don't know that Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street was inspired by a true story. It was published by the LA Times. A young boy suffered horrific nightmares and actually died in the middle of one. Wes Craven said, "The boy told his parents he was afraid to sleep, that if he slept, the thing chasing him would get him. So he tried staying awake days at a time. When he finally fell asleep, his parents thought the crisis was over. Then they heard screams in the middle of the night. By the time they got to him, he was already dead. He died while having a nightmare." I bet you didn't know these creepy facts that'll staying awake days at a time. When he finally fell asleep, his parents thought the crisis was over. Then they heard screams in the middle of the night. By the time they got to him, he was already dead. He died while having a nightmare. I bet you didn't know these weird facts that'll probably make you uncomfortable. Heartbreak can cause a massive flood of emotions. So many emotions that it can cause a fatal heart attack. People's general happiness peaks at 21, and they don't reach that level again until they retire. Yeah, that checks out. People who stay up late have more psychopathic tendencies than those who sleep early. A different version of you exists in the minds of everyone who knows you. The brain not only named itself, but it also recognizes that it named itself and was surprised when it realized that. Kind of weird, huh? I bet you didn't know these shocking confessions people came clean with while on their deathbed. The man E. Howard Hunt, who was a CIA agent who served under Richard Nixon. On his deathbed, he made several recordings. I bet you didn't know these shocking confessions people came clean with while on their deathbed. The man E. Howard Hunt, who was a CIA agent who served under Richard Nixon. On his deathbed, he made several recordings confessing to his involvement in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He also listed other participants. Lieutenant Walter Haut confessed on his deathbed that aliens did, in fact, crash land on Area 51. He had been forced his whole career to tell everyone it was a weather balloon incident. On his deathbed, Roscoe White confessed that he was the second gunman in the JFK assassination. He was a former Marine and Dallas police officer. For decades, residents of the village Brattleboro would randomly discover garden gnomes in their yard. It even brought a rise out of the media. It started popping up on the news and everything like that. His name was Peter Layton. And whenever he was passing of prostate cancer, he confessed it all. He even had his son write something about it in his eulogy. Naaman Diller, he confessed to stealing Marie Antoinette's pocket watch from a museum. He confessed it to his wife on his deathbed. He told her where to find it and to sell it for money. When she tried to sell it, authorities showed up, and she explained how her husband had stolen the watch. All right, y'all, I got a whole bunch of requests about the Russian sleep experiment. So you can check out my YouTube and my podcast. I go over the whole creepypasta of the Russian sleep experiment. So check it out and let me know what you think.
I bet you didn't know these creepy facts that'll probably make you uncomfortable. A Colombian woman carried a mummified fetus in her uterus for 40 years. It was discovered when she was 82 years old. The fetus was completely calcified. Humans have a primal gaze detecting system, which means you can sense when someone is looking at you, even if they're not looking directly at you. What about when you get that feeling when you're all by yourself? You can sense when someone is looking. Humans have a primal gaze detecting system, which means you can sense when someone is looking at you, even if they're not looking directly at you. What about when you get that feeling when you're all by yourself? Siberian bears sometimes dig up dead bodies from cemeteries and snack on them. So it's kind of like they use cemeteries as their own refrigerators. Apollo 11 only had 15 to 20 seconds of fuel left when it finally landed. Over 50% of pilots have confessed that they have fallen asleep while flying a plane. Maybe that's why they have two pilots in the cockpit. I bet you did.